Hi, everybody. Shavua Tov. You're listening to Eve Harow on my show, Rejuvenation, for the Land of Israel Network. It's very late on January 25th, 2020, the very end of the month of Tevet, 5780. I'm not going to talk very long right now because the interview that you're about to listen to, I hope in its entirety, is quite long. It is with Eliezer ben-Yehuda, the grandson and namesake of the famous Eliezer ben-Yehuda, who is responsible, probably more than any one individual, for reinvigorating and rejuvenating, if you will, Hebrew as a modern spoken and written language. I taped this interview already quite a few weeks ago, and for a variety of reasons, including the fact that I wasn't sure if I should split it into one long one or two. I'm only broadcasting it now. His grandfather's 162nd birthday was just a few days ago, so I thought this was an opportune time. But I also needed to precede the interview with a few sentences of explanation. Eliezer ben-Yehuda, the lovely gentleman whom I was really privileged to interview, was a rabbi living in Florida. And of course, the question would be, and was asked, why were they not in Israel? And he's not the only one. One of the more difficult issues and time periods was the 1950s. After the state is born in 1948, the 1950s is a hugely difficult decade. We have the people who survived the Independence War. 1% of the Jewish population was killed here, 6,000 out of 600,000 people, who were joined very quickly by whoever the Nazis didn't kill in Europe, with all their traumas. Isn't even a word that fits here, as you can imagine, with everything that they went through, and they come here. And then we have, within the next few years, they are joined by 650 to 700,000, maybe even 800,000 Jews who get thrown out of the Arab world and Africa for no reason other than they're Jews, or some of them flee, let's say Algeria and other places where there's all kinds of uprisings, and Jews always get caught in there. So the 1950s is a constant influx of refugees, and not enough food, and terrible conditions, and a lot of poverty, and as I said, just a lot of trauma. People left. Some people left because it was just too difficult for them, and they wanted, they had relatives somewhere else, so they wanted a different kind of life. There was a lack of opportunity here, which is totally understandable. But there were some people who very much wanted to stay, and they couldn't stay because doors were closed to them. If you were not a member of the Histadrut, of the union, if you were politically on the wrong side of things, if you weren't part of the Ben Gurion camp and the Mapai people, what we today would call left, although you can't compare them to today's left. Today's left didn't exist because today's left would have been considered anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, like the way I consider many of them today. But that's another discussion. They were definitely Zionists, and they definitely fought very hard. And the Haganah, of course, had taken a lead role in defending the state. But after the state was declared, there was also a lot of vindictiveness. And there were people who had been involved with the Irgun, or the Lehi, or didn't have any connections anywhere, who couldn't get an education, where doors were closed to them, where jobs weren't available to them. My long time listeners might remember that a few years ago I interviewed Dr. Matanya Ginosar, who's one of the world's experts in climate change. I really should have him back. And he was one of those families from Lehi, and Irgun, I believe, I think it was Irgun, who left Israel because they were essentially forced out. Jeremy Ben-Ami, the head of J Street, the organization that does its best to undermine Israel at every turn, his father had to leave, who had no opportunities here. And look where that got us. Maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe some of the anger that he grew up hearing, not against the people of Israel, not against the Jewish people, but against what became then the establishment, maybe that turned him so against what so many of us, stand for and believe. So there were a lot of ramifications to what happened. A lot of these people shut down. They didn't talk about what was going on and why they had left Israel, out of loyalty and out of love for the state, not wanting to badmouth the state any more than it was already having such a tremendous time. Unfortunately, that's still continuing, of course, where Israel is to some degree a pride state, and many of them did not want to add to that. So they took their grief, their feelings of betrayal, and they made new lives for themselves in other places. But it has to be talked about because it is not a pretty time period here. And I think that we're strong enough now, confident enough now, and that we can unpack some of the things that happened in the past and discuss them. And so this is just something that I wanted to lay out before you hear the interview with Eliezer ben-Yehuda, because his family was one of those who were really not treated the way they should have been, given their contributions to, let's say, Israeli culture, if you will, and of course, much more. So the interview, as I said, is it's a bit over 2 hours. Listen to it at your leisure, however you want to do it. I don't tell you guys how to do it. And I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you give me feedback. I love hearing from my listeners, and many of you are in touch with me. If you want to see me, if you're able to, in person, I'm going to be in the States. I'm leaving next Saturday night. Got some personal things going on during that first week, including meeting with someone who wants me to write a book. And so I'll be spending a few days with him, seeing how we're going to go about doing that. But then the following weekend, I will be in New York City from Thursday, February 6th until Tuesday, the 11th. My main reason for going there is to attend the One Israel Fund's 25th anniversary dinner on Sunday, February 9th. So if you want to join me there, would love to see you. And if you'd be in touch, maybe we can get together at some other point while I'm there. And then I will be back in the States at the end of February for APAC, for the Shabbaton. We are planning an event Saturday night. For the last few years, we've had our own Judean Samaria event on Saturday night. That is still being planned. It's kind of a crazy year because of Israeli elections. Most of us Israelis are going to be leaving there. Many Israelis aren't coming, but those of us who are coming, because we still think it's really important to interface with Americans, both Jews and non-Jews, who descend on Washington for that weekend. But we're going to be leaving pretty much on Sunday because election day in Israel is Monday, and we want to get home to vote. So it's going to be kind of a crazy weekend then also, but be in touch if you're going to be in Washington at the end of February, and maybe we can meet up. And you can also keep checking my website. I'll also announce it here on the show when we actually get that Saturday night, the details on the Saturday night event set down. Anyway, Eve Harow, once again, on Rejuvenation. Thanks to Ben. Thanks to Tabitha. Thanks to everyone on the station. And again, hope you guys have a great week. It's going to be a very exciting week. We'll see what happens with the peace plan reveal, shall we say, in Washington. But we'll hope for the best. And hopefully, finally, after all these years, maybe we'll get some justice done, and Judean Samaria will finally and officially become part of the state of Israel. So we shall see. Not letting up on the gas, though, for 1 second. Still much to do. Hi, everybody. This is Eve Harow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network, and I am sitting with Eliezer ben-Yehuda. So for those of you who are familiar with the recent Israeli history, Eliezer ben-Yehuda is probably the man who is primarily responsible for the rejuvenation, to use the word again, of Hebrew as a living language. And it was not such a simple thing when, before the state was even begun in 1948, already a century ago, there was discussion about what language was going to be used, and some people thought German should be used, like in the Technion in Israel's MIT, that was the language of science, and other people said, no, it should be French, because that's lingua franca, and other people said, no, it should be Yiddish, because we can't use Hebrew, it's a holy language. Eliezer ben-Yehuda is going up on against a whole lot of people, and I, just by serendipity, happenstance, whatever you want to call it, was with a friend the other day who said to me, Eliezer ben-Yehuda is in Israel. And I said, really? And he said, yes, the grandson of. So I took what I thought was really a very special opportunity and called today's Eliezer ben-Yehuda, who very graciously agreed to sit with me and give you, my listeners, and also me, a little bit of an education, perhaps, on a different side of his grandfather, or maybe some things that we don't know from Googling him or Wikipedia, or the many, many things that have been written about him over the years, and even a song that was written about him, a popular Israeli song. So first of all, Eliezer ben-Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer ben-Yehuda, yes? Thank you so much for joining me here today in Yerushalayim.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to be here with you. And as you said in your opening remarks, to tell you a little bit about Eliezer ben-Yehuda, because while he is very well known, he is also unknown. The history of the rebirth of the nation, the Jewish nation, in its own land, speaking its ancient tongue, the tongue of the prophets, the tongue of the Bible, whatever you want to call it, the language that is called Hebrew. Now, for sure, one might say, but wait a minute. In ancient time, everybody spoke Hebrew. Yeah, I wish that all the people who live today would take cognizance of that and stop, as some of them do, blaming my grandfather for making a holy tongue into a sacrilegious tongue. But let me begin by telling you that I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and in the first 25 years of my life, I lived under the thumb of being the grandson of Eliezer ben-Yehuda, and it was very difficult.
Was he still living? Did you know him?
No, Eliezer ben-Yehuda died in 1922, and though I am not exactly a young man, in 22 I was not even a gleam in my dad's eyes, So I was born in 38 and lived through the Second World War and the revolt against the British that brought about the United Nations investigation and then decision to create two states in this war-torn land. And then I grew up in the state of Israel, and I served in the army. I also served during the War of Independence when I was very young, because there weren't enough people to be soldiers at that time. And if you heard about the underground army that became an army the day David Ben-Gurion on a Friday afternoon made this a state of Israel.
You were all of 10 years old.
Kids that were...
Well, that I know, because when I guide people in Mount Herzl, the grave of the youngest person who retroactively is made an Israeli soldier, Nissim Gini, if I'm not mistaken, Gigi, who's killed in the old city of Jerusalem, and there's a marker of there.
Were brought back after 67 war.
Yeah.
I knew him, and we were in the same youth movement. It was a youth movement. We used to be like walkie-talkies. They didn't have walkie-talkies, and so they used messengers, and we used to run from one place to another, and we used to sometimes carry written messages, or other times we just had a spoken message, and so on and so forth. And I was on Mount Zion during the War of Independence when the Haganah opened the gate and went in. But I was on top of the Dormition Abbey with the machine gun person, and I was his number two because there weren't enough people to have a soldier with him. And so I stayed out, and Gigi went in, and of course, later on, what happened was that we opened the gate, but the British-led Arab Legion came in and closed the gate, and those who were in remained in, and those who were out remained out. And there was a fierce battle there, and a lot of people got killed, including Gigi.
And ultimately, we lose the old city between 1948 and 1967. The Jews are all thrown out, and the Jordanians do a good bit to destroy the Jewish quarter.
I was in the south of Jerusalem and in Ramat Rachel, which changed hands 4 times. And
major battle with the Egyptians there, yes, in Ramat Rachel.
The only battle in the Jerusalem area. The Egyptians came in from the Negev through Beersheba and up the mountain road, and they attacked Ramat Rachel, and we were able to withstand that battle. and they captured actually the whole kibbutz, but we had a counterattack and we came back, and then the Jordanians came in, and they also were repelled. Now they took Bethlehem and Hebron and everything like that, but Ramat Rochel remained the southernmost tip of the state of Israel in the Jerusalem area.
And that's where there's a beautiful hotel there now. One of my sons got married there, and that's where I go to swim. They have a nice pool, indoor pool, and that's where I swim. So I go, and they have in their parking lot remains of a first temple palace and beautiful water gardens. So everywhere we go, there's modern history, there's ancient history. It's everywhere.
And you know that they had the conference there in the 60s, I believe.
Well, where the archaeologists were killed?
Archaeologists, and there was shooting from
the Jordanians would snipe whenever they could.
Exactly.
So it was really, and now it's just a beautiful place. And because thankfully, we're sitting outside and someone's sitting on his horn. That's what you're hearing.
Before the war, I had friends in Sur Bahar. And
Sur Bahar is an Arab neighborhood of Jerusalem.
It's right on the other side, east of Ramat Rochel. It's an Arab town, a village, a large village. And before the 67 war, it was in the Jordanian area. And since then, it's in our area. And at one time, in 67, 68, all the way to the time when the first Intifada started, it was open to Israelis. And I visited there a number of times. And afterwards, it became unpleasant.
So, whose son are you? Because Eliezer ben-Yehuda had quite a few children. Obviously, you're a son of a son because you carry the same last name.
Correct. Eliezer ben-Yehuda had 11 children. He had 2 wives. The first wife was his childhood sweetheart, and she was in Hebrew we call it eshet chek. It's the woman you marry because you are very excitedly in love with her, and so she married him. He became sick when he was preparing to marry her by learning medicine in Paris. So he intended to come to Jerusalem after he finished medicine and would marry her and be able to support her in the style in which he was going to become used. But it didn't work out that way because he became sick in Paris because he lived in a very cold, unheated room in a poor neighborhood in Paris, and he did not have a lot of means to have 3 meals a day and a warm room. And so in the winter he got sick, and the influenza that he had turned into tuberculosis, and he went to a special clinic for poor Jews that Rothschild, the great philanthropist, created in Paris. And they told him, make your peace with the world because you're not going to survive till summer. And he said, well, that's kind of difficult to take. And they said, well, you can go to Algiers. Algiers at that time was part of France. And they said the Baron built a special sanatorium in Algiers for people that got sick in Paris. So if you go there and you'll be warm and you'll get 3 meals a day, maybe you'll be able to survive for a few more years. And so he did. He went to Algiers, and the clinic paid for his trip, and of course he had to give up his the medical education. But he got better, and he decided to go to Jerusalem because all along he had the idea of Jewish Renaissance in the Jewish land, speaking the Hebrew language. He said the things that are necessary to make the Jewish people into a nation are a land and a language. That was his motto, you see. And so he came to the land. He came to Jerusalem. He didn't come to Turkish-occupied Eretz Yisrael, or as it was called back then, southern Syria. You see, he came to Jerusalem, period. And everything he published, he was an author, and everything he published was published by Eliezer ben-Yehuda, Yerushalmi, the Jerusalemite, you see. And he started a newspaper, and people didn't know that they could learn of the news by reading a newspaper and then use it to wrap the fish the next day, you know. Right. So in order to be able to have a newspaper, he had to create a word. Because in the days of Jeremiah and Isaiah, there was no newspaper. Surprise, surprise. Now, of course, the Jews that lived in Jerusalem, first of all, they were not called Jews. It was very funny. Abroad, they were called Jews and they were persecuted. When they came here, they became citizens of the country from which they came, and they had a consul who was taking care of their needs and of their issues. How strange. Russian Jews had a Goyish consul, you know, from Russia who came to protect them. And the same is true for Polish Jews, and the same is true for French Jews, and British Jews, and American Jews, etc., etc., etc. And they had extraterritorial rights even back then under the Turks, because the Turks were at the end of their empire. So anyhow, ben-Yehuda came to Jerusalem. He had a different name in Lithuania where he was born. But when he came to Jerusalem, he Hebraized his name, and he became Eliezer ben-Yehuda.
Ben, for those of you who don't know, means son of.
That's correct.
So Eliezer ben-Yehuda means the son of Yehuda. Ben-Gurion did the same thing. David, he changed his name from Green. His father wasn't Gurion. Right. But that you see that a lot. Yes. Ben, son of, like in English, John's son, or things like that. Same idea.
Exactly. And in many other languages, yes.
So he marries your aunt. Slightest spoiler alert.
No. He had a sweetheart in Russia, where he came from. You know, Lithuania was part of Russia. So he met this girl. She was 3 years older than he was. He was a yeshiva boy, and you don't meet girls in a yeshiva. But an issue happened, and if you want to, you can buy the book and read all the stories about it.
Your book?
My book. I have a book in English, which is called Fulfillment of Prophecy, and is available online from Amazon. In Hebrew, I also have a book that I published just this past February, which is called All the Loves of Eliezer ben-Yehuda, Kol Avotav Shel Eliezer ben-Yehuda, and it speaks of his love to women, and of course his love to the language, to the land, and to the people, to make a nation here. So
passionate man, huh?
Yes, indeed. Very passionate man. Now, unfortunately, not everybody, first of all, the people that lived, the Jews that lived in Jerusalem, mostly came here to pray. And they were greater or lesser degree of religiosity. Most were fanatically religious. Some were not quite as fanatic. So when this man came to Jerusalem and didn't want to join the, so to speak, caste system, where Polish Jews were Polish and only talked to other Poles, and Jewish people from Morocco were not called anything. They were not even recognized. You know that when Herzl started Zionism, no Jew from outside of Ashkenaz was invited to the party. Not that they weren't there, but nobody knew about them. Eliezer ben-Yehuda was sent by the Baron to Algiers, and he found the Algerian Jews. And he had learned Hebrew. From age 3, his father was a Hasidic Rebbe. And he used to teach, he used to preach, he used to do whatever he could as a Hasidic rabbi in a small village in Lithuania. But from age 3, he started teaching his son Torah. And Torah was in Hebrew. And so he learned it in Hebrew, and from Hebrew it was translated to Yiddish, which was called verteidigt. That is to say, made German. We shouldn't know from such German. But anyhow.
So I want to get back to his 3-year-old girlfriend, but I also, at some point, he leaves the religious world, correct?
Yes, because his father died when he was 5 years old. So his father influenced him and fashioned him as a Hebraist, you see, in his childhood. And by the time he died, he was studying Torah, and he was studying Mishnah, which is also in Hebrew. And then his father was teaching him the meaning of the words. You see, so he knew the meaning of those words. He knew what Bereshit bara Elohim meant. He couldn't speak a language because it was not a spoken language. But he knew that it's there. You see, now, what happened was that after he died, his mother was a widow. She didn't have means whatsoever. And so the rich Jewish man in that little village was her uncle. His name was Wolfson, by the way, which is a very wealthy family. And I was told by Wolfsons in America that it's one family. And the Wolfsons in America are very rich. The Wolfsons in England are very rich. The second president of the Zionist movement was a Wolfson. So anyhow, she said to her uncle, my son was born for a special purpose, to be a rabbi, to be a great rabbi. She had a dream. You can read the whole story, as I said, in the book. But she said somebody has to help him to educate, to learn. And my husband is dead. So he has to go to Cheder. Somebody has to pay for the Cheder. So
Cheder is the school, the little
yeah.
school. It literally means a room,
Right.
but it was where you would learn Torah.
And it was the first non-graded primary school. Years later, everybody thought that this was a real innovation. But the Jews had been doing it for hundreds of years. Anyhow, he had to go to Cheder, went to Cheder, finished Cheder in less than 1 year. So 6 years old instead of after bar mitzvah. Right. He couldn't learn for bar mitzvah.
So a real genius.
He was quite well, he was smart.
So then where does he go at age 6?
So again, the mother went and said to her uncle he has to go to a yeshiva. And so they sent him to a yeshiva. The uncle, by the way, was not married and didn't know his elbow from his elbow. And so he did. He said, okay, I'll pay for his yeshiva. But he has to go there by himself. So they sent him, to walk to the next town over and go to a yeshiva there. And so, he went to yeshiva there. And at age 13, he came back home. And he had a bar mitzvah, and he did very, very well on the bar mitzvah. And all the less poor Jews in town were very jealous that Eliezer ben-Yehuda, the son of a widow with 5 kids, has a son who goes to a yeshiva out of town. And so they started telling the uncle, you're supporting a little boy who used to learn in a yeshiva, and he went to cheder here in town, in our village, but now he's really becoming a non-religious Jew.
Was that true, or they just told that to the uncle?
True, but they just wanted to trip him, Now, the reason that they told that story is because he used to read in a small book. His Rosh Yeshiva, the principal of his yeshiva, taught him grammar. He said to him, you're such a smart boy, you really ought to understand the structure of the Hebrew language. Because if you know, basically, about 3,000 words, you know the language. Because everything is connected in one way or another. Sometimes, by the way, the same word or the same root can be the exact opposite of...
Depending on the context.
Yeah, but anyhow, so if you learn grammar, everything is going to be good for you. And so he gave him a little booklet, which was a grammar book. Later on, by the way, in the story that was told by other people, not the family, they say that he was caught with the book Robinson Crusoe, and that proved that he's not studying to become a rabbi.
Because he's reading something secular or something out of the realm of the religious world.
But
So
he was not. The fact of the matter is, and I researched it, the breakup occurred when Eliezer ben-Yehuda was 14 years old. It is true that the book Robinson Crusoe was actually translated to Hebrew, but it was translated to Hebrew the year that he was 14 years old. And so the chance that the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, would have a brand new book that just came out. He lives in a small town in Lithuania.
there's no Amazon to order your book from.
And the book was published, somewhere in whether it was in Vienna or in Paris or, somewhere in the big cities where there were enough people that would buy such a book for their kids.
Yeah, I mean, who knew how to read Hebrew then? I mean, no, the literati did speak and write in Hebrew, but that would have been it.
And that would have been kind of a curio, to bring it to your kid and say, here, let's see if you can read that,
Right.
So the story is that he had that book and that they stole the book from him. They scared him. Eliezer. He was studying the grammar in a Gemara book, in a Talmud, and it was like a little book that was like maybe 20 pages,
Like a pamphlet.
Yes, exactly. Now again, it was not Robinson Crusoe. You couldn't put Robinson Crusoe inside another book, but it was like a booklet like that, supposedly. That's what the story is. And the long and the short is that the uncle who was supporting him was a very nice man, but of course he was totally ignorant of Hebrew. You see, so that when they brought it to him, he didn't know what it was. And all he knew was that he was wasting his money, quote unquote, on a boy that is cheating and not really going to yeshiva and becoming a great rabbi. So he expelled him. He came home and he grabbed him and told him, get dressed. It was late at night. Get dressed. The boy dressed and he said, here is your prayer shawl and your tefillin. Good luck. I'm not here spending my money on raising a rebel.
So that's when he leaves organized religion, when he's on his own?
Well, I don't even know if he would leave organized religion. What happened was, of course, first of all, he was very confused. He didn't know what had happened. Why is he, he didn't understand why he was sent away altogether. But, he started walking, and he walked to the next town, and in the next town, There was a synagogue. He went into the synagogue and fell asleep. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning. And at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, when the men came to start the morning service, they had the morning service, he heard them coming in. It woke him up, and he laid tefillin, he prayed with them. And then there was a man there, a very nice man, and he looked, like a European man. And he approached him, and he said, "You're new in town, young man. Who are you? What are you?" And so he told him the story. And the man said, "Oh, you're probably hungry because you walked half the night, Come to my house. I will treat you to breakfast." And he came to his house, and he treated him to almost 3 years living in his house. Because, again, it's not in the stories, but I think that the reason he invited him over is because he had a daughter. And his daughter was 17.
So this is the girl that he eventually...
What happened was he took the boy, he brought him home and put him in his library. He was an intellectual. Eventually he also came to Israel, and his name was Shin Nud Hey. It just went out of my head. Jonas. Jones, Jonas. And he had a factory in which he was brewing beer and vodka. And his beer and his vodka were so good that eventually he got permission to move to Moscow. But this is before he became famous. His beer had become famous. So he was in this small town in Lithuania, which eventually became part of, the Soviet Union, etc., whatever have you. Anyhow, he had this 17-year-old daughter who was absolutely lovely, who was brilliant. She spoke the language of the country, Russian. She, of course, spoke Yiddish. In the family, they all spoke Yiddish. She also spoke French. She also spoke German. And so, and she didn't just speak it. She could read and write it. So Eliezer, and of course the man had a library. And he had a room like If I Was a Young Man, in the song from Fiddler on the Roof. He had one staircase going up and another going down, and a third one that didn't do anything except to be there. Anyhow, he had a library. And in the library, he had beautiful books, leather covered and everything like that. And they were all, of course, with Cyrillic letters. And ben-Yehuda is looking at the back of the book, and he can't read it, but he says, well, I don't know what it is, but I'll open it and I'll read it. And he opens it up, and he can't even read the alphabet. So when the father, the man, went to inform his wife that they have a guest, and probably tell her, maybe our daughter something, So, anyhow, he comes back to the library, and ben-Yehuda is holding 2 different books. He says, "How can I not read them?" And Jonas says, "Well, it's because it's in a foreign language." And he says, "How can I learn it?" And he says, "Well, I have a teacher for you." His daughter. And he says, "Who is the teacher?" And he says, "My daughter." And Eliezer, first of all, he's really shocked. "You're going to let your daughter speak with me, teach me, be my teacher?" And he says, "Yes, it's okay. Everything will be very proper, And so he says, "Okay, my wife has dinner ready. Come to dinner." He comes to the dining room, and Jonas introduces him to his wife, and then he introduces him to his daughter, Devorah, who is 3 years older than he is, and she's a teenager. She's beautiful. She's unique because he's never met a person like that. he had sisters, but they were sisters. They were mishpacha, they were family. So, she gives the hand. How do you do? Says, I don't do it this way. What do you mean? How do I do? Right. But anyhow, Yonah says, it's okay, And so he shakes her hand, and he says, she speaks all the languages of these books. You want to read the books? She will teach you.
So that's what brings them together.
And so that brings them together. They sit together at a small table by a window with bookcases on the left and on the right in that library. And of course, they have to be somebody to watch over them. Yonah's family had a young daughter, 2 years old. She's going to be the one who's going to sit in the room with them. Okay. So she's sitting, in a little playpen or a chair or something. I don't know how it was, But she's sitting like on the other side of the library, and they're sitting by the window, and she's looking at them, and in the first part of the day, in the morning, the sun was in the window. And both Eliezer and Dvorah were light-haired with red in the hair. They were not gingy, but they were...
They called strawberry blonde,
yes,
I think.
Strawberry blonde, exactly. I didn't want to use the word, but if you want to use it, that's fine. Yes, that's exactly what it was. And when she's looking at them and the sun is in their hair, they look like they all have a halo on their heads, So to her, it was the stuff of fairy tales. Right. And she sat there day after day, and she saw them studying, and speaking in French, and speaking in German, and speaking in Russian, and reading books, and to her, it was just like fairy tale.
So how do you know? How do you know? Okay.
Because she told me.
And who was she to you?
She was my grandmother. She was the second wife. What happened was, they fell in love with one another. And
Dvorah and Eliezer.
She knitted for him a shawl that was so long that he could wear it almost as a blanket. Because, they were there for 3 years. He was there for 2.5 years. So the long and the short, before he left, the name of the town was Globoka. And eventually, the town recognized that Eliezer ben-Yehuda spent time in that town, and coincidence, we met, and you used to live in Waterbury, Connecticut.
So my grandparents, before I turned down the mic, we were speaking.
Lived, and then we had your father lived in Ethiopia Street, where my grandfather lived, and we also had some other town.
So just to fill my listeners in on a few coincidences that Eliezer and I came up with before I turned on the mic. One is that my mother grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut. That's where my grandfather was the cantor in the synagogue, and Eliezer was telling me that he was in Waterbury, Connecticut when Kennedy was assassinated and went to the synagogue then. But also my father, who grew up in Jerusalem on what's called Ethiopia Street, or Rehov Chabashim, grew up in the same house that Eliezer's grandfather, Eliezer ben-Yehuda, lived in for a while. So yes. We've got some connections here.
Now we're talking about Globoka, and I can't show it to you because it's too bright. We are sitting in a beautiful, almost summer day in the city of Jerusalem, which usually by this time would be very cold and perchance snowy. But anyhow, last week I was in this park a little bit further up, which is called the first station. It was the first railroad station in Jerusalem, and one of the first in the whole state, in the whole country. And there was they have these little push carts, and people they sell their wear. And there was a man who was making jewelry, and I walked there with my wife, and I looked at the jewelry. She didn't, because she knows that I'll buy it for her and everything will be okay. So I looked at the jewelry, and he had made silver earrings with little stones, and I said, "Oh, I'm sure my wife would love it. I'll ask her if she wants to have a pair of earrings." And I asked her, and she said yes, and she chose the ones. And then I started talking with him, and I said to him, "You do very beautiful work. Do you happen to? I don't use jewelry, but I use cufflinks." I said, "Do you sell cufflinks?" And he said, "No, but my wife does." And so we started talking about his wife, and I said, "This woman is my wife. Her name is Leah. My name is Eliezer." And I said, "I'm the grandson of Eliezer ben-Yehuda." He said, "I can't believe this." We were in the former Soviet Union recently, and I was in a town that you probably never heard of. It's called Globoka. He says, and there was a statue of Eliezer ben-Yehuda. And I said, "No." And he says, "Yes." And he opens his pictures in his smart phone, and he shows me the picture. I said, "My goodness, can you transfer it to my telephone?"
Only 2 degrees of separation between any two Jews. It is really amazing. But I want to get back to the love story because we don't have too much time. So he leaves. He ends up in Paris in medical school, then in Algiers. How does he get back to Devorah?
He gets sick with tuberculosis. And the doctors told him that at any rate, even if he goes to over there, in Algeria, he's still not going to have a very long life. And particularly because he's a young man and he's poor and he doesn't have a profession or anything like that. And so Eliezer, who was already bitten by the Zionist concept, the idea, which he had as a full picture. In other words, his dream was the renewal of the Jewish nation in its land and in its language, just like that. And he was the only one who had that concept. All the other people that thought about a return, some of them wanted a religious / people renewal. Others want a political renewal, but nobody put the whole thing together except for Eliezer. And Eliezer said, "Well, if I only have a short period of time to live, I better go to Jerusalem, and maybe, I won't succeed in doing everything I had in mind, but maybe I can start a fire and somebody else will carry the flame." And so he wrote a letter to his to the man that was going to become his father-in-law, who became really his spiritual father, And he wrote him a letter and he said, "My dear Father Jonas, I promised your daughter that I will come back for her, but I'm sick and I'm dying. Please speak to her gently and tell her to forget about me and to find somebody else." And the father goes and he tells his daughter that. And she says to him, "No way." She says, I'm not releasing him from his promise, and I'm going to go and I'm going to cure him and I'm going to marry him and we'll live happily ever after." And the father says, "No, you can't do that. First of all, because he doesn't have long to live. Secondly, because you specifically said, I'm divorcing her before I marry her. I can't marry her. She says, I don't care. I'm going to go to him and I'm going to do, because we're supposed to be together. And she says, please, Daddy, please help me. And he can't say no.
Right.
And so Eliezer wrote that he's going to take the Orient Express train, that goes from Paris all the way to Istanbul. And he's going to stop on the way to meet the publisher of a newspaper that published an article that he had written, in which he called on young people to become pioneers and come to Israel. And so they arrange, and again, it's a story, it's in the book, it's very exciting. The book is an exciting book because it's a very exciting story. And the long and the short of it is, she meets the train when it comes to Austria, to Vienna, and he can't believe that she's there. But he also doesn't want to let her go. And if she chose to come to him, then he has no choice but to marry her.
Right.
As if this was such a terrible thing, And he marries her and they go to Jerusalem. No, actually, they left together but not married. And ben-Yehuda said, I'm not going to marry you, and I don't want us to conceive a child. Back then, especially Orthodox Jews, when you got married, whoops, first child is on the way already, So he said, when we get to Jerusalem, we'll make the child. And so they got married. Actually, they took a ship to Alexandria. And in Alexandria, they met a rabbi who married them. And again, there are all kinds of stories about that. And the long and the short is that they're now in Jerusalem. He's working on a newspaper that exists in Jerusalem, except it's not a newspaper, it's a journal. And it's a scientific journal of Judaism and of its books. So people write articles about Torah or about prophets or whatever have you, And it's published in Jerusalem, but 9 out of 10 papers go abroad, and they are sent by mail all over Europe. And so ben-Yehuda becomes the assistant editor, and he wants to write news. And of course, the editor says, no, we write good stuff here, only good stuff here, And he says, well, can I have a, like a Friday magazine? And it says, well, okay, once a month.
An insert, yes.
Yes, and once a month you can have an insert. And so he writes news, and he writes about Zionism, and he writes about, the people that live in the land, and what are the problems, and so on and so forth.
Current events, as we would say.
Yes.
But is it true that he will only speak Hebrew to his children, and no one else is speaking Hebrew, so his children can't talk to anybody else?
There were a few people that spoke Hebrew, and they became his friends. And but when his wife became pregnant, which was soon after they came to Jerusalem and got married and came to Jerusalem, he said to her, no, our son, our child, whoever it's going to be, must be a Hebrew child. He cannot hear anything but Hebrew. And we're doing this because people say that Hebrew is not a language. Hebrew is holiness. And it's impossible. Hebrew is a language. And it's the language that we need for the nation. And, they're saying there is no nation. There are only Jews. Smart Jews and stupid Jews, but there are only Jews, And so it's a big controversy. And he said this child has to speak nothing but Hebrew. And the child and his wife listens to him. And so he doesn't start talking until he's 4.5 years old. Most kids start talking somewhere around 2 years old. So all his friends in Jerusalem are telling him, you're going to have an idiot son because you can't have a child hearing nothing but Hebrew. So at 4.5, when they have an argument, Eliezer and Dvorah, the son can't stand it, and at one point he starts hollering at his dad, "Die, Abba, die." And he doesn't mean die, D-I-E. He means enough. The Hebrew word for enough is die.
By the way, I had that happen to me in a supermarket in America where one of my kids said to me, "Die, Ima, die," and people looked askance.
Yes.
But yes, it's a different translation.
Anyhow, he started talking, and then afterwards, he actually was the first child. Eliezer wanted to call him Itamar. Itamar was the son of the high priest Aaron. But when the Moel came, that's when you get the
who
name.
does the circumcisions.
Yes. He didn't ask, what name are you giving him? And when he said the prayer, he said, V'yikareh shmo b'Yisrael, ben-Sion ben-Yehuda. His name shall be ben-Sion ben-Yehuda, the son of Zion, the son of Yehuda. Which, of course, that's not what the dad wanted. But he had no choice, because when he said, "Excuse me, what have you just said? It's not right." He said, "Shah, enough." And then later he explained to him that when a child is born to new parents that didn't have children before in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is called Zion and Jerusalem, so the child is called Ben-Sion. And there were many Ben-Sions in Jerusalem back in those days. Anyhow.
So they go on to have a total of 5 children, he and Dvorah?
5 children in 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, she dies of his disease.
So she marries him thinking that he doesn't have much time, and in the end she
he
precedes
stopped.
him. Yeah.
She told her dad, he's gonna live.
Right.
But she didn't know that she was risking her life, and they were so poor that she gave her life for him because she wouldn't eat so that there would be enough for him to eat. So she lost weight and she, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end
Don't some of their children also die in childhood? Of the 5?
Of the 5 children, 3 died in the first year of her being gone. There was actually a disease that ripped Jerusalem. A lot of people died. It was a kind of influenza, and the 4 out of the 5 children had the influenza. The only one that did not have it was the girl that eventually became an adult and married and is not. Doesn't follow on. Her family did not follow on. But
so we already know that then he marries your grandmother, Chemdat.
You see, this is what people don't know, is that the romance continues. The daughter, her name was Paula, of Jonas. She had that vision of these two, like in a dream, and then he leaves, and then she leaves, and they're living in Jerusalem, and the girl grows up, and the father is invited to live in Moscow and make the brew for the Tsar, and she goes to the university. And she goes to the university after Marie Curie. So she decides she's going to become a chemist. And she's going to the university to become a chemist. And all of a sudden she gets a letter from her sister Dvorah. And her sister Dvorah says, "Dear sister, my days with Eliezer are coming to an end. I don't want you to cry for me because I lived a lifetime with Eliezer. But my time is coming to an end, and your time is beginning. If you want to be a princess," she writes, "come to Jerusalem and marry my prince."
And that's what happens.
And make a long story short, that's what happens. She comes to Jerusalem. She forces herself on Eliezer because he's afraid that she will catch it like Dvorah did.
He'll lose her too.
You know? And he didn't want to do it, but she said to him, "Okay, you don't want to marry me? Fine. I'll come to Jerusalem. We'll live together, and I'll take care of the 2 children of my sister. Of course, there'll be a scandal in Jerusalem, but if you can live with it, I can live with it." Wow. He says, "Wow. Yeah. I thought it was difficult to say no to Dvorah, but this kid is a terrorist. I have to marry her." Right. So he marries her. And the romance continues. But she's a different girl from Dvorah. She's not a homebody. Dvorah was a homebody. This one is a go-getter, which is exactly what he needed at that point. And so she goes to Europe, and she finds a publisher who will publish a dictionary. Because if he tried to publish it in Jerusalem, nothing would have happened. And if she was not backing him, even the things that he did with Dvorah would have failed because she died too quickly. You see? So she was really the woman of valor, whose price is above rubies. And she did all these things, and she pushed him, and she put steel in his backbone and made sure that he's going to succeed and he's going to do things. And they traveled together and they met all the great people that needed to be behind him. You see?
And in the meantime, she also gives him, 6 children?
And he gives her 6 children, yes. And also 3 die. And so she's left with the 2 children of Dvorah, who really were already half grown, and they're gone very quickly. Her first child is a girl, which she calls Dvorah, and who is there to comfort both Eliezer and her, because she loved Dvorah too. And when this girl was 7, something happened, and nobody really knows what happened. But she was in the garden of their home in Ethiopia Street, and she was on a swing, and her mother went in to do something, and Eliezer, of course, is working, and she comes out, and the child is on the ground, and she's dead. So maybe she
what a tragedy!
Maybe she fell off the swing. Or maybe she went to look for something and whatever have you. Or maybe some kids walked into the garden and attacked her and did something to her. But whatever happened, she was dead. That was it, So that was a really very, very tragic event. There was another child that died in infancy, and then she had a boy, and she called the boy Ehud.
And that is your father?
No.
No. Okay.
He was a consolation to her and to Eliezer. And she was taking good care of him and so on and so forth, but she was also very involved. And one day she puts him down to sleep. He's 6 months old, maybe 8 months old. And she comes back an hour later to see if he's up yet. And he's lying in the bed, and she tries to wake him up. And it was crib death. The child died.
Oh my God. Any one of these things that would have happened to any of us would knock us flat. And here they have one thing after the other.
Yes. Yes. And she becomes pregnant again, and she has a boy again. And she calls him Ehud again. And she hires a woman to take care of him. Because she continues. Eliezer ben-Yehuda all of a sudden could not be the editor of his newspaper because he was put in jail and all kinds of things. You have to read the book. But anyhow, she's busy. She has to, she's not Dvorah. She is the go-getter. And so she gets a woman to come and take care of him. She's still breastfeeding him. She's taking care of him. But most of the time, she's not there. And so she tells that girl, she said, you put him to bed, he has to sleep for an hour. But you make sure you stay near him and you make sure that he's breathing. And if he stops to breathe, you count to 20. And if he doesn't breathe another breath but 20, you push on his chest. And you push on his chest until he breathes. And who knew about crib death back then? But she said, well, if this happened, it can happen again. Okay, so she took care of that, And then she had 3 other kids. So she had 6 kids, and 3 died, and my father and 2 sisters survived.
I'm finding 7. We have Devorah, we have a child who died in infancy, we have the first Ehud.
No, and there was another girl that was born and died, But there were 6. She had 6 kids, So that's the story, and
So to circle back to you. So you are Ehud. Whose son are you?
I'm a son of Ehud, yes.
You're the son of Ehud, and
Ehud
we started off.
Who has the Hebrew name ben-Yehuda.
When we started off, you said it was a burden having the name of Eliezer ben-Yehuda when you were growing up.
It was. It was because kids are very cruel. And, they don't like anybody who sticks out like a thumb, even if it's a healthy thumb, not a sore thumb. So, I was a very friendly, funny guy, and they didn't want, And so here comes that story, I told you, the song. So when I was growing up, the greatest professional singer in Israel was a Yemenite woman by the name of Shoshana Damari. I loved that woman. I loved that young girl, when I was young. So was she, pretty much, She was a little older than me, but still, I was very precocious, so I liked her. And because I was the son of Ehud and the grandson of Eliezer, I met her, and so on and so forth. But she had a brother. And most people don't know about the brother. But she had a brother who also sang. His name was Saadia Damari. And he also wrote Yemenite songs. And when I was in first grade, he sang a song on the radio about Eliezer ben-Yehuda. And I didn't hear it, because on Shabbat I didn't hear radio. My grandfather on the other side was very Orthodox. So I was from a mixed marriage. In Israel, a mixed marriage is somebody who is not religious at all marrying somebody who is from a very, very religious home. And so I didn't hear those songs. And Saadia Damari introduced his new song, which was a song about Eliezer ben-Yehuda. And it went this way. Eliezer ben-Yehuda meshuga. Eliezer ben-Yehuda meshuga. Eliezer ben-Yehuda meshuga, 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 meshuga. meshuga לשפה העברית. Eliezer ben-Yehuda is crazy Crazy, 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 crazy for the Hebrew tongue. And my friends who sang it to me, because they were able to learn it very quickly from the radio, never got to the last line. So they just went after me and sang, Eliezer ben-Yehuda is crazy. And I proceeded to fight the whole first grade and came home bruised and bleeding, but satisfied that I protected the memory of my grandfather. 50 years later, by the way, this song of Saadia Damari did not become a very popular song. I don't know why, maybe because there was a story in the paper about the grandson beating up all the kids in his class. But anyhow, or maybe not, I really don't know whether I made the paper back then. But the point is that it did not become a very famous song, and, but the attitude of the students in class with me didn't change. And they hounded me in an absolutely difficult way for me to sustain.
I see how many years later it still hurts you. I see it on your face.
No, but it's more than just that. For example, the teachers. I was supposed to, in third grade, maybe even it was second grade, the Hebrew teacher told us to write a chibur, a little composition. And so, I had a friend by the name of Danny, and Danny wrote a story about his grandfather. And he says, I have a grandfather. My grandfather comes from Germany. He is a very sad man because he is the only one that survived from his family. That was his chibur. This was his composition. And the teacher said, "Nice boy, Danny. I'm sorry to hear about your grandpa." So I wrote a story too, and I wrote about my grandfather. And the story was about how sad my grandfather was when his first wife, Dvorah, died, and how Dvorah knew that he was going to be very sad, and that he, in fact, might die if she doesn't get him another wife. And so she wrote the letter to her sister, and her sister decided to drop out of the university and come to Jerusalem and take care of her niece and nephew and marry him and have children with him. And they lived happily ever after. And I wrote a real chibur, I wrote a real story. It was 2 pages long, and the teacher collected. A couple of people read. I was not invited to read mine, but the whole class had the homework, and it was collected by the teacher. And a couple of days later, she returned the papers. And mine said, "Interesting, but I expected more."
Wow. So you could take that, I suppose, as a backhanded compliment in some way? No?
No, I didn't. And that's just an example. And this is the way I went through. And then, of course, the war came. And even before the war, we had, most people don't know, but we really had kind of 3 wars. Yeah. In 46, 47, we had a war that nobody talks about. Mm-hmm. It was called the Revolt, Hameri, and everybody fought. Haganah, Palmach.
To get the British out.
Everybody was together at that point, you see. And then what happened was that we got very daring. The first thing that we did were all destruction of property and no lives. Now, at one point, they blew up a little section of the King David Hotel. Nobody knows why. Do you know why they blew that section?
From what I've understood, that was the military headquarters of the British Army, and that's why the Irgun, although the Haganah also. This is the story that's told.
No. it was it was a special place. That section that was, it was cut like you cut a cake. It was amazing how they did that. Was the offices of CID, Criminal Investigation Department. That's what it was, you see. And in that building were the files on every Jewish boy from age 9, I was 9 years old, and I'm sure they had my file because I was doing things, little things, carrying a gun from here to there, a pistol, not a gun, a pistol in my pocket like it was a toy, nobody knew, and I brought somebody who needed, a pistol, or I was carrying a message or something, This was before there was a war, you see.
So I want to just give my listeners a little bit of a background. During World War II, there's a very big difference between the paramilitary groups here in Israel, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi. And one of the major differences of opinion they have is what to do about the British.
Yes.
Because the British are here, have slammed the gates shut, and are not allowing Jews who are fleeing the camps to come to the land of Israel. Even though that's the whole reason they got the mandate for Palestine.
Yeah, and in spite of the fact that Jews are volunteering to serve in the British Army.
So therefore, you have certain people that say the Haganah who say we have to lay off the British because they're fighting the Germans who are killing our relatives in Poland. And others here saying, what does it matter, like Begin, because they're not letting the Jews in here.
They also did not attack the British. The Etzel also did not attack the British during the war. You see?
But after 1945, when the war is over, enough. The British need to let them people in.
The only people that did were Lehi. You see, and they attacked Lord Moyne in Egypt. Lord Moyne was the one who was in charge of the foreign policy in the Middle East, because England, had enough troubles with the Luftwaffe. They didn't need to worry about Palestine. You see, so no. What happened with the Lehi is that they assassinated a man who was really carrying out a hateful policy. A ship of Jewish children came through from the Black Sea, from Romania, to Turkey on the way to Israel. The British forced the Turks to send it back. And luckily, there was a Catholic prelate, like the ambassador to Turkey, who later became John the 23rd. And people from the Jewish agency went to him and they said, look, you got to help us. These kids are going to be sent back. And they're going to go
to a certain death. Yeah.
Yes. And so he went. It's a miracle. He went and he faked baptismal certificates for all these children. And he went to the Portuguese ambassador in Turkey. And he said, I have a ship of Catholic children. And we have to get them out of Turkey and not have them go back. And they were all taken to Portugal. And at the end of the war in Portugal, they were all brought to Israel. And that is why John the 23rd was a blessed man who became Pope and who really changed the hateful policy of Catholicism against Jews. So, maybe it was because of what Lehi did. I don't know. Whatever it was, there were miracles.
Right.
So Lehi did what he did. The British caught the two men that shot him, and they executed them. They executed them. Did they deserve to be in prison? I suppose so. But they were soldiers, and they were in war against the British. They wanted to save those children. They didn't know that they're going to be sent to Portugal. And they wanted to decry the fact that the British will not allow children.
Look, what the British did here in terms of not saving Jewish lives in the 1940s, it can be discussed ad nauseum, and I'm going to emphasize ad nauseum. And that's something that's really not, I don't think, spoken about enough.
Right.
There are crimes of omission and crimes of commission. And I do it as well, because there were many things that should have been done and weren't.
For people to know that they really betrayed the trust. They were given a trust for this land, and they betrayed a trust.
But despite them, in 1948, and with lots of people, 1% of the Jewish population being killed here during the War of Independence, and tremendous, tremendous difficulties, and some people were killed here were the last survivors of their family who had made it out of the camps and then die here.
Right.
And that whole time period is just an incredible time period. But it's 1948, and now we have in Israel, and you are now an Israeli living in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But not having such an easy time because of the family name, despite the tremendous contribution your grandfather made.
Because, the Jews didn't know how to create a state. The Jews didn't have a chance. America, it had a couple of 100 years as colonies, you see. And other countries, had their ways, and many of them didn't succeed either, you see. But now, Israel came into being in 1948. Everybody says the UN created Israel. It's not true. The UN did not create Israel. The UN exposed the issue in Palestine, in British Mandatory Palestine. But number one, the people in the UN, by and large, didn't really care about Israel. Secondly,
how refreshing that nothing changes. Yeah, go ahead.
But the thing is that even then, the partition plan was merely a theory. It was merely a plan. The only part of the UN that could mandate, that could create something, is, even today, the Security Council. The partition plan never went to the Security Council. Never. And had it gone, it would not have passed. It would not have passed because British would have had a veto. You see, so it never went to the UN, to the Security Council. It succeeded because the Arabs made mistakes. They did not meet with the UNSCOP, the group that came to investigate the issues. And when the vote was taken, they said, we don't care at all. We just don't recognize your right to make a decision. You see, they didn't go to the Security Council. They never went to the Security Council. Luckily for us, the one man who was really the life force of the new United Nations was the Secretary General, Trygve. And Trygve wanted to help the Jews. And so he said, well, we voted, and the British said they will leave on the 15th of May. So on the 15th of May, you have a United Nations decision, whatever you want to call it, because it's kind of like a theory. Mm-hmm. It's like, if you go to your kindergarten teacher and say, I go to the bathroom, I want to go to the bathroom. And she says, sure, I want to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. You're 3 years old, you don't know how to do it anyhow. And now she's given you permission to do what? Mm-hmm. You have to do it yourself if you know how. If you know how. And if not, you're going to wet your pants.
So
Israel was given the chance to have a state. But all those new academicians that tell you that it was an even battle between Arabs and Jews, it's just not true. I had to be a soldier at age 10. Mm-hmm. I carried a gun certain times, not all the time, but I carried a gun. We used to have a gun called the Sten gun, which was supposed to be a machine gun. you could shoot 3 bullets, one after the other. If you shot the 4th one, the barrel would bend because the steel was not properly finished. It was a homemade machine gun, you see. So it was before we learned how to make an Uzi.
Yeah. Now Israel is, I don't know if it's good or not, but we're at the top of knowing how to defend ourselves and make these guns.
Yes.
But I want to get back to more of your personal story.
Why am I telling, why am I in Israel? Or what am I doing actually today in the United States?
Well, yes, that's what I wanted to ask you. So here you are, the grandson of Eliezer ben-Yehuda, and you live in the United States.
Why am I living in, first of all, why did I go to the United States? In 1955, I was a soldier, and, Uncle Sam is the one that runs the United States, and Uncle David was the one who ran Israel. David Ben-Gurion. You blamed him for everything, and you give him credit for everything. And so I was a soldier, and I was sent abroad. And I was sent abroad first to Europe, because I spoke French, and I spoke German, and I spoke English, and I was somebody who spoke not only as a young soldier, but also as the grandson of one of the people that started the state. You see, so I went to Europe, I spoke at conferences, I spoke at children, teenagers, with Habonim and with Noam Meuchedet and youth groups of different kinds, scouts, in Hebrew schools, Jewish schools, all over Europe. And then they decided to send me to the United States. And so I went to the United States. And all in all, I spent about a year and a half in outside of Israel. And a little over a year in the United States. I went to the United States in December of '55, and I stayed there until June of '57. Right. So it was a year and a half. And when I went there, the last school that I was in was a yeshiva. And so when I went to the United States, I wanted to go to the university. And I went to the university, and I thought that, I could take an exam and get into the university. Well, of course, it doesn't work that way. And they said, do you have a high school diploma? And I said, well, it's kind of difficult because I lived during a war period, and very often the school didn't function, and one thing and another. But I do have, I did go to school for a while, and the school that I go to recommends. They give a paper that recommends a person, And I said, I have this paper, And so I showed it to them, and they looked at it and they said, it's in Hebrew, can you translate it? I said, yes. And I said, can you get it notarized that the translation is correct? I said, yes. So they said, okay. So did you study biology? I said, no. I said, oh, okay. Did you study math? And I said, well, I studied math back in, in my 3rd grade. I said, no, we're talking about,
calculus and high level.
Exactly, I said, no, okay. Did you study history? I said, oh, yeah, I'm very good in history. I know a lot in history, I know French.
You lived it also. Yes.
I know French history. I know English history, Great Britain, British history. I know American history. I studied, I read voraciously. Starting before age 10, I started voraciously. Anyhow, I said, yeah, I know history. No, but did you study in that school where you have this paper from? And I said, no, you see, it's hard to explain. It's like I heard that you have a school, a university in England called Cambridge. And you go to the school for 4 years, and then you take an exam, and then they give you a bachelor's degree. And I said, well, we don't do it that way here. Mm-hmm. You have to go to school, and you have to have X amount of credits, and so on and so forth. So I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't have that. And they said, well, here in New York, there is a thing called prep school, where they prepare you to get a baccalaureate, New York State high school diploma. And you can go there, and working children go there, working teenagers go there. It was a high school, and if you can pass the exams and take the exams, then you'll have a high school diploma, and you can come to the university. I said, well, okay, I'll go and talk to them, but can I get in here in the meantime? And they said, sure. You can be a non-matriculated student.
So may I ask where you had the money for this, though? I know the tuitions weren't what they are today.
They're not, right? And actually, I took, the first exam I took was the SAT, and I got 1,600 in SAT. So after I got 1,600, everywhere I went, and I said, can I take classes here? And I said, oh, sure, welcome, please. Where do you want to sit? Yeah. Anyhow.
So you then stayed. You got educated and then stayed in America.
So no, because I came here really for my government, for the government of Israel. I came to United States, and I knew that it's temporary. So I went to this prep school. It was called Rhodes School, and it was a real fancy school on 54th Street, right off Fifth Avenue. And kids there were kids that were in the theater and in the ballet and, all kinds of things like that, And, of course, it was a private school, and they had tuition there, which was quite high. But when I introduced myself, I met with the dean, and I introduced myself, and I explained to him that I'm an officer in the Israeli service and that I'm grandson of Eliezer ben-Yehuda, etc. He said, if you want to come here, we will accept you, and we will give you a scholarship.
But where did you live at the time? And I assume, were you still semi-observant, or Judaism was still a big part of your life?
I had a place. I was provided with a place. Very nice. So, well, it was part of my...
Let me guess. They had a daughter 3 years older, and then a little baby. No, you weren't replaying that part.
I was not replaying that. I was still really on duty. Yeah. And the good thing about that school is that if you didn't attend every day or every week or whatever have you, so you didn't. Okay. So I used to float. And I did things, and when I could, I used to take a class here, a class there. But they gave me the material that I had to know in order to take the exam. So in 3 semesters, I did 16 Regents examinations of the state of New York, and I aced most of them. And a couple of them I got 98 or 97 instead of 100, and I got a high school diploma. And, of course, after I got this high school diploma, everywhere I went, I had a copy of my records, and they all said, oh, sure, please come in. So they let me in. But then Uncle David called me back. He said, okay, it's time for you to go back. So I went back. I had to go back. I went back. I went back to Israel, and they wanted to reassign me in the army. At this point in time, I was already in the regular army, and they wanted to reassign me in a manner that I did not want. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I said, I want to stay in Israel. And they said, well, but your talents fit better out of Israel. We think you ought to go out of Israel in the service. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I've had 4 years now, 3 out of them outside of Israel. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm sorry. I know I'm very young, and you may say that you can get another 10 years or more out of me, but I'm not interested in that. I can't do it. I need to be grounded here. I want to meet a girl. I want to get married. I want to start a family. I want to do it now. And I said, and anyhow, I've been doing this since 1946, really. I said, so, I was stupid. I started very young, and I lied to you about my age and everything like that, but, I'm tired. It's been a very long time where my life was helter-skelter, and I don't want to do it anymore. So they said, well, we want you to do it, and if you don't want to do it, then we're putting you back in uniform and you're going back to active duty. So I said, okay, you can have me. I had 8 more months that I had signed for. I said, I'll go for the 8 more months. And as it worked out, after 6 months, I was on a vehicle in the Arava, and it went over a mine, and I was wounded, and that was the end of my service. You see? And then they released me, and they said, goodbye, do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And
so what did you do?
I went abroad. I went to Israel.
You were in Israel.
I went out of Israel. I went out of Israel, and I went to the United States, and I had met a good number of people when I was there who were not aware of anything about me not being quote-unquote kosher. And so when I came back, I was still getting over my wounds because I was wounded. And
in what way weren't you kosher? I misunderstood.
Because I was really part of the military,
okay.
But they didn't know me as a soldier, They were I was just a young man, So in that sense, a lot of those people were, by the way, at Jewish Theological Seminary.
The conservative movement's head organization.
After a while, they said to me, why don't you take a pulpit and work?
Become a conservative rabbi.
Be a conservative rabbi. So I did.
But you had here fought the establishment here that you wanted to live in Israel. And then when you were out of the army on your own, you go to the States and become a conservative rabbi there.
No, but I could not, at that point in time, I could not have lived in Israel. Number one, I didn't have a profession. Mm-hmm. I couldn't become a rabbi here. For sure not.
For sure not.
Right.
Yeah.
Number two, I needed help to become whole again.
Mm-hmm. You were traumatized from all these years of battling?
I was wounded, and I had a bad
physically
foot.
whole.
I had a physical issue, and I had to find a doctor who was going to do an extra operation and help my one leg that was really bad, and it was done, but so that was a second issue. And the third thing was that I didn't have a home. My parents were, my dad was traveling out of the country, and he rented the home that they had in Jerusalem. And I didn't have a place to stay in Jerusalem. See, once I got out of the army, good luck, buddy. It was very difficult. And if I had stayed here, for sure I would have needed something, to have seed money so that I could get a mortgage and get an apartment or something like that, and that didn't work out. So I said, well, I'm going to go abroad and I'm going to continue my college education, which I started during that 1.5 year that I was in the United States. And I'll get a profession that I can use to, to earn my living in this country. And, it was kind of a thing where my talents sent me in one direction, and I found that it's much easier for me and is necessary. I became a necessary commodity in the United States that was not for sale in Israel at all.
So to be a little bit provocative here, the army wasn't wrong when they just wanted you to come out to be outside of Israel under their authority. But the idea that your talents were better served outside the country, they were onto something there.
Well, no, if I would have stayed in the army, it would have been a different thing. They did not want me in the army anymore, really. They were trying to, do a Uriah on me. Uriah? Yeah. So they didn't want me. They wanted to
look up that biblical reference on your own, everybody. It's with David and Bathsheba. We'll leave that for now.
Yes. And so, that's the kind of thing that happened to me. And I, pulled the embers out of the fire, and I decided to do something else, to go somewhere else. And
may I ask how your family felt about that? I mean, here you have a family that's Israeli in so many ways, siblings, parents. I don't know if your grandmother was still alive at the time.
No, my grandmother was not alive. My parents were very struggling to survive too. They had their issues with the state of Israel. We became transparent. Nobody cared. No, really, nobody cared. It's just like, ben-Yehuda Street is one of the 3 main streets in Jerusalem. Yeah. And the sign on Ben-Yehuda Street says Ben-Yehuda Street. It doesn't even give a first name. One time I was walking in Jerusalem on Ben-Yehuda Street, and there were 2 soldiers walking behind me, and I'm listening to them. And one says to the other, "So who's this Ben-Yehuda?" And the second one said, "Well, Nativa Ben-Yehuda, the one who's on the radio." Well, first of all, she's nobody to be very proud of. She was a Palmachnik, she was a nice, one of the Chevre, but that's not Ben-Yehuda Street.
So I just want to interject something from my listeners who are, I would imagine most of you are not aware of a lot of the tensions of the 1950s. First of all, this is an incredibly poor country with no friends struggling. If you're not a survivor of the Holocaust, you've just been thrown out of the Arab world in North Africa for reasons having nothing to do with anything that you did, or you survived the years here in the war, it wasn't just a 6-month war. It was many years and even decades of suffering and pogroms. So everybody here in the 1950s is hungry, is traumatized from one way or the other, and not only that, but the leadership of this new state of Israel is also not being very kind to people who were their political rivals during the time. And I've spoken and I don't know if your family falls into that category, just something I want to add, that I've spoken to amazing people whose families were associated with the Irgun and the Lehi and more the Menachem Begin, the revisionist side of politics in the pre-state years, who left Israel. Incredible people who have made such a contribution to the country, but couldn't get jobs because there was a union here that only took the like-minded people, the Histadrut. And there were many people who had poured heart and soul into this country who ended up leaving, not because they didn't care about the country, but because it was just too difficult to deal with the bureaucracy and with other people. And so I don't know if your family, if you fell into that category, but that is
into that category, absolutely. Now my parents, they had a place here, but my parents had two families. They had me and a sister, and both of us left, and they were alone, and they were still, they certainly thought they were young, and so they had another child. You see, and that child they raised very differently from us, very protected, very, kept in very safe and secure situation. She went to school here. After school, she went to the university. After the university, she went for a PhD. After the PhD, my dad was gone, but my mother took her to America, and she was postdoctorate at University of California, Berkeley. So she lived differently.
She had what you'd say is a normal childhood, not a child of war.
A normal Israeli childhood, and I love her very dearly, and get along with her fine, but I couldn't come back to my parents' home again. The issue is, I don't have a home.
So you stayed in the United States with welcoming people?
I stayed in the United States. I created a career for myself in the United States. I found a love in the United States. I got married. I have children with her, and we have, so it's just the way things work out sometimes.
You told me that...
Do I like to be here? I love to be here. Would I be willing to, at this point in time, come back here? Without a doubt. But I have a wife, and the wife is American. And if it was only she would also move here. But we have kids, and the kids are in the United States. We have one boy here, but all the others are in the United States. And she has grandchildren. We have grandchildren in the United States, and she wants to be near them. You see? So this becomes an issue. It becomes a dilemma. You see? And at this point, I don't have the wherewithal to have two homes, one here and one there.
Really? You didn't get a fabulous salary as a conservative pulpit rabbi? I'm so surprised.
Well, you sound very entertaining, but
no, but I know very well.
You know very well that that's not the way it works.
It's really public service in every sense. But when I met with you before the mic went on, and you told me you're actually here because a grandson got married, and the grandsons that are here got married, and you're here because you just published a book in Hebrew. So your heart is still here, your past, the language is still alive.
And I was here for the book in February. You see, so, and I'm very proud that the book was published. The book was published by Yediot Achronot, which is the biggest publisher in Israel. I don't get a penny out of it because I don't earn money in Israel. When I come to Israel, I give my time freely. Yesterday I spent the whole morning in a school in Mevaseret Zion. Before that, last week I was on TV in Yafo on I-24. So I'm doing these things. I have no problem doing them, and and I don't ask for payment. I didn't ask you, will you pay me for this long interview? I don't do that. I come here proud to be in Jerusalem, happy to be in Jerusalem, proud to speak about Eliezer ben-Yehuda, so people will understand that Eliezer ben-Yehuda was not a crazy man that just had this strange worm in his head that made him fanatic for Hebrew. Eliezer ben-Yehuda had so much vision. For example, one of the stories about ben-Yehuda is that the people that bought land that became Tel Aviv, Levontin was one of them. He came to see my grandfather before he bought the lands. And my grandfather told him a lot about his experience, because he had been here by then 2 years, and 2 years in Israel, you're an expert. So he told him about Israel, and he said, well, I'm sure you'll find land here in Jerusalem. He said, oh no, we already have land that we decided to get. It's right near Yaffo. Everybody can come off the ship at Yaffo, and they'll come there, And ben-Yehuda, who was not a graduate of West Point, he said, no. If we want to conquer this land, said to him, if we want to conquer this land, we have to establish ourselves on the hilltops. A yeshiva bocher from Vilnius, from near Vilnius, has the brain to understand that he who has the top of the mountain is also going to be the king of the valley. He said, you're going to live near Yaffo? It's Jerusalem. First of all, Jerusalem is Jerusalem. Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. No, this will be better. So it was better.
I live on one of those hilltops in Gush Etzion.
9-mile state.
Right.
Imagine if that was all we had. Imagine if some of us weren't crazy enough to fight for Jerusalem.
So this book that you've published in Hebrew, are there any plans to translate it into English? The Loves of ben-Yehuda?
I have an English book.
But it's not the it's pretty much the same?
Same story,
Okay.
but the emphasis is different. If you are fluent in Hebrew, read the Hebrew book and read the English book. You can get it from Amazon. And
Give the name again of the English book.
the English book is Fulfillment of Prophecy, and it's published by Amazon. Today they have a different name. They changed names. I don't know why. But anyhow, it is available from Amazon.
Okay.
And the Hebrew book is called Kol Ahavotav Shel Eliezer ben-Yehuda. It's available in every Stamatsky store. It's available in every other store, It was just recently published, so it's not... if they don't have it in the store, they can certainly get it for you.
Do you have pictures in the book? Pictures that you have of your family? Nothing?
All my pictures, all the ben-Yehuda pictures, are in the Zionist archives, and I have to pay to get pictures of my family. And it's an exorbitant price.
Well, you don't have pictures that the family had of their own? Everything went into the National Archives?
Yes. Yes. My father, God bless him, alav shalom, may his memory be blessed, was a babe in the woods. And after he finished publishing his dad's dictionary, proceeded to create a pocketbook, Hebrew-English pocketbook, which was published in the United States. And he went to the United States to publish it. That's why he wasn't here, But then he came back and he lived the rest of his days here. He, after the creation of the State of Israel, the government spread its protection over the ben-Yehuda undertaking of the dictionary. It doesn't mean that they hired my dad. It means that they provided, from the Ministry of Education, they provided an office in which the editorial staff could sit and go over his handwriting and get the last few volumes ready for print so that they would be published. My dad had to publish them. My dad had to pay for getting them printed and bound and everything else, not the government. You see? And then, when he finished it, they told him, "Thank you very much, Mr. Ben-Yehuda. You are dismissed." Never got a...
no royalties or anything like that?
No, there were no royalties.
Yeah.
But it's not a question of royalty. He should have gotten a retirement from the government. Didn't get it. You see?
Yeah.
So, but that's the way it went back then. And from the pocketbook and from going abroad and lecturing, they made ends meet. The government arranged for the Ben-Yehuda home to be purchased by the municipality of Jerusalem, with the purpose understood that it's going to be a Ben-Yehuda museum and a place for scholarship of the Hebrew language. Lo dubim velo yar, not bears and not woods.
That has to do with Elisha. Go look that up in the Bible also.
Yeah. So the thing is that it killed my dad. My dad died of a broken heart because the house was neglected, and the house almost came to the same ending as the house of Joseph Klausner. Joseph Klausner left his house to the state, and it was plowed under, and the land was sold, and somebody went and built an
apartment building.
There. The only person, all the famous people that lived in Talpiot and Arnona, were all people who came after Ben-Yehuda, because he had a home there. Ben-Yehuda home, luckily, still stands, because my dad provided, when they didn't make a museum out of it and the house was starting to crumble, he met a German minister, Protestant minister, by the name of Krupp. You know, the same name as the man that used to make all the arms for German military. And this minister he established a society to atone for the crimes of Germany. Young people that were willing to come and work with Holocaust survivors. And they created a house of peace, Pax-Haus in German, and he was looking for a house. And my dad met him and convinced him that the place for him was the Ben-Yehuda house in Talpiot. And so he accepted it. He asked Teddy Kollek to give him the house.
And the mayor at the time of Jerusalem.
Teddy Kollek gave him the house with a lease for 99 years. And the man repaired the house. And again, strangely enough, he got the right to build a dormitory, an extra house behind the house. We had a big backyard, and they built another house there. You have to go and see it. Have you seen? Do you know the town?
No, and I'm going to go.
If you want to go, if you do it quick, soon we can go together. I'll go with you, because they know me and they're friendly with me. There are German people living in that house, and what happened over the years is that they have fewer and fewer volunteers. They still have some volunteers, and I think they will have that house for 99 years, but they don't have people living in that back of the house, which is like a dormitory type. It's like for want of a better word, it's a bed and breakfast place. And they started a bed and breakfast place, And they have rooms because they were going to have classes to teach their people who come, the volunteers, to teach them a little bit about the history of Jerusalem, a little bit of that.
Well, in the they should teach Hebrew if they're in that house.
Nowadays they teach Yiddish. My poor grandfather must be turning.
He must be turning in his grave, which is on the Mount of Olives. Yes, overlooking the old city.
Again, that is also a story. Have you been to the ben-Yehuda grave? So, do you know how it came about?
Well, I know it wasn't destroyed by the Jordanians, who destroyed many graves between 1948 and 1967.
Right. But how come he has a house? He has a property.
Yeah.
A
like
family.
A little mausoleum almost, which is very unusual for their.
What happened there is Eliezer ben-Yehuda was put in cherem.
He was excommunicated.
Excommunicated. And so when he died by the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem, when he died, first of all, when his wife died, the first wife, they didn't want to bury her. And so he went and he got the Sephardic burier people to come and bury her in the Sephardic area. And the Ashkenazim said, no, you can't do that. She is Ashkenazic. And he said, are you going to bury her? And they said, no. And he said, well, fine, we're going to bury her. We have a dead body here. We have to decide what we're going to do with it. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to throw it out for the dogs?
So he was excommunicated because he was desanctifying the holy tongue?
Yes. He argued with the rabbi, and he said to the rabbi, you mean to tell me that Hebrew is only for prayer? He said, yes. He said, so how did Jeremiah said, I want to go to the bathroom? And the rabbi had no answer. And that was the end of the argument, of course.
So that's how this family plot is in the Sephardic section?
When the mother was, when his wife died, she was buried, quote unquote, somewhere on Mount Olives. For all the years that my grandmother knew about burial in Har HaZeitim, in Mount of Olives, she didn't know where her sister was buried. The Chevra Kadisha lost the papers, supposedly. And only when the Jordanians gave us back the Mount of Olives together with all of Jerusalem.
Well, they didn't give it. We liberated it, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, but I'm being kind to them. Then the people who are in charge of the area started going one little place after another, and they found the little stone that was placed on her grave. It's all the way on the top, right near the hotel, is her burying ground and that of a couple of children. They buried the children.
But your grandmother is buried near Eliezer ben-Yehuda?
My grandmother was actually buried in Sanhedria because she died when the state was here.
Oh, and we'd lost access to the Mount of Olives.
And then when it was liberated, they moved her over to the burial ground. But if it's interesting about this grave, because this grave is the only one that you can tell from a distance. You know why? There is a frame around it. There is a small...
like a fence.
A small fence. And over that fence, there is a wrought iron fence with a door, with a gate, with a triangular top, and on it is written in Hebrew characters, ancient Hebrew characters, is written Lemechayel Shonenu Eliezer ben-Yehuda.
Who did that?
Meginei HaSafa Ivrit.
So
You
the
know that there
people
was-
who, yeah,
the people who fought the battle of languages, that
they put up the special sign on his grave.
Germans who had Realische Schule, which is now Bet Sefer Reali, they wanted to have a German MIT. And the Hebrew teachers said, no, it's going to be Hebrew, or it's not going to be. And they had a war. And the war was fought from Abyssinia Street, from Ethiopia Street, from the balcony where Eliezer spoke to a street full of Hebrew teachers. Anyhow, when he died, they asked my grandmother what she wanted to do. My grandmother was also a lover of Eliezer ben-Yehuda. You know, she was the child that had this dream, you know, that had this vision of these people, both her sister and her boyfriend. She said, I'm interested in keeping Eliezer ben-Yehuda alive. And now he's going to be alive through his dictionary. This is what I want to concentrate on. So you decide what you want to do. I don't want to fight with anybody. So this group of defenders of the Hebrew language, with Yudelevich, you know, who was one of the first presidents of the teachers' organization, and other people from Petah Tikva and from the Moshavot in the Galilee, you know, they all went there and they told the Hever Kadisha, we hope you're not going to do shenanigans about the
Give him the honor he deserves.
about the burial of Ben-Yehuda, because we're going to have a state funeral. And really, they had the first state funeral. There were over 20,000 people who followed his body. You know, in Jerusalem, they don't put you in a box. You know, they wrap you up in the shrouds and in the cover, and they carry you like that on a stretcher. And that's what they did to him. And what they did is they went, and in an area that was open at that time, they said, this is Eliezer ben-Yehuda. He needs something special. So we want to sell you 9 graves, 3, 3, and 3, so that you can bury him in the middle. And that's going to be a special grave. This will be more than anybody else that's going to be buried. It was never done. Nobody else has that.
So like a family plot.
It's not. They're going to build a fence around it. And they're going to bury Ben-Yehuda outside the fence. And you know what that means.
Yeah.
It means they're really saying he is muhtzeh.
Yeah. He doesn't belong in this
doesn't belong.
cemetery.
And so he was buried there in the middle, you know, on every line. You know, he was in the middle. And he was the only one to be buried there. The children that died were not buried there. And Itamar ben Avi was, you know, was still alive. Everybody was still alive, you know. So he was the only one right in the middle there. Now, Itamar ben Avi went to America working for the Zionist organization.
Itamar ben Avi is Ben Zion. It's
Ben-Zion.
that first
Yes, the
son who
first
only
child,
speaks
right.
Hebrew. Yes.
So he goes to the United States to raise funds for Israel. He was the first person to go. And the second one, of course, was Golda. You know, but anyhow, he goes to the United States and he raises funds, and he's stuck in the United States after Pearl Harbor Day. And he continued to work, and he overworked himself, and he had a thrombosis. He had a stroke in the head, and was left alive but unconscious for close to a year. Nobody paid any attention to him. His wife and his 2 daughters were with him, and nobody cared for them except for some friends that they had. The 2 daughters went to work to earn some money so that they could support themselves with a little, food and things of that nature. And they came back to Israel immediately after the Second World War in 1945.
Wait, so where is he buried?
And he was left in the United States. He was buried in a special cold box, so that he left instructions that he will only be buried in Jerusalem. In 1946, my dad went to America to raise money to publish the last 3 volumes and to bring his brother home. His brother was brought home, and he had a funeral that started in Haifa. His remains were in a box, in Haifa. Came off the ship, was put on a car, on a special pickup, and there was a funeral in Haifa. Itamar Ben-Avi was one of the 2 founders of Netanya. Netanya was started with Ben-Avi and Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami became the mayor, and Ben-Avi went to America to raise money for Israel. The property that Ben-Avi had in Netanya was expropriated by the British to make a military camp, so that his wife and his daughters, when they came, couldn't go and live there either. And they came to Jerusalem, and they lived in their family. The woman he married was one of the nobles of Jerusalem, Jews that had 9 generations in Jerusalem. The family Abu Shdid.
Sephardi family. That was a big deal in those days, a mixed marriage, Ashkenazi, Sephardi.
And they didn't want to marry Ashkenazim back then.
The Sephardim didn't want to marry Ashkenazi because they were the royalty and the Ashkenazim were the riffraff.
Exactly.
Wait, so he's buried then in Jerusalem in the end?
Yes, my dad came back, brought him, and buried him in the ben-Yehuda plot. He said, hey, we have 9 plots.
Yeah, might as well.
We're going to bury him there. And so he was buried on the right side of his father. So it's ben-Yehuda is in the middle, and then the middle right line is Itamar Ben-Avi.
Are there still family plots open there?
Yes. Now what happened was that the next person, there was the reconnection of Jerusalem, and they brought Chemda, the second wife, and buried her to his left. Okay, so he has his second wife and his first son.
So you should live to be 120. Is there a place for you there?
The next one to be buried was Leah Ben-Avi, Abu Shdid. She was buried at the head of her husband. The next one who died was my dad. So he was buried at the feet of his brother. Then my mother passed away. She was buried at the head of her mother-in-law. Okay, so now there is a spot behind a head of Eliezer, and there's a spot at the bottom of Eliezer, and there is a spot at the bottom of Chemda. There's 3 more places there, and most of the ben-Yehudas don't want to be buried there.
And do you?
I don't really care. When I died, I think it depends where I'm going to die. If I happen to die in Jerusalem, there's a good chance that I will be buried there. But if I'm going to die in America, there's a good chance that I will be buried there because I have children there, and whatever have you. I don't really know what I want. I haven't bothered to.
Can I have a lot of chutzpah and give my opinion? Some kind of closure to be here with your relatives who did so much.
But if I die, even in Europe, to bury a person from Europe in in the Mount of Olives costs in excess of $30,000 because you have to import the dead body and you have to get all kinds of documents.
So my next suggestion is don't go to Europe. It's fine.
Yes, stay here, right? Stay in Jerusalem and wait until you die.
Oh, God forbid. Like I said, up until 120. I want to thank you so much. And I want my listeners to get the book and read the book. And you just got a little bit of a glimpse of the stories. Difficult to hear. We would like to sugarcoat a lot of things that have happened. But the reality is different, and it's been a real honor for me to have sat with you and hear from you.
I didn't conclude what I'm doing back here. Okay. You see, because ben-Yehuda is well known, obviously. There's a popular song about ben-Yehuda that was written not by Saadia Damari, but by the author of very, very wonderful Israeli songs, Yaron London, and the song became very, very popular. Chava Alberstein sang it and made it famous. A number of men sang it, including the man who wrote the melody, Mati Kaspi. But and the song, the words of the song are wonderful, except the refrain. The refrain is written in a language that can be understood in two different ways. The first line says, Eliezer ben-Yehuda, Yehudi mevadeach. Now, the author says that mevadeach means a funny Jew, a funny man.
Bedicha is a joke in modern Hebrew.
Yeah, you see, but what does it mean, a funny man? And to me, it suggests that he was a clown. Eliezer ben-Yehuda, the clown. Eliezer ben-Yehuda, the funny guy. The guy that had this, zvuv in his
Not to
ear.
be taken too seriously.
He had a fly that went into his ear and drove him crazy. And so he went around telling people, speak Hebrew, speak Hebrew. He did. He did tell them to speak Hebrew. The language was so necessary. I go and I tell people a story about the War of Independence. We won the War of Independence. Like a miracle. Everything we tried worked right. People don't know that we had one huge failure. The failure was to open the door, the gate to Jerusalem, to open the road to Jerusalem. We had two battles on the road to Jerusalem in a place called Latrun. It started right after the state came into being. The Latrun fortress, military fortress, the British built.
I don't want to interrupt, but I have to go. And so
Okay.
I just want to
Very
talk
quickly.
about the song and why you're here
Okay.
and not Latrun. Okay?
No, but very quickly, the battles failed because the soldiers didn't know Hebrew.
They didn't have a common language to speak to each other.
right.
They'd come from different places. Some spoke Polish, some spoke Russian, some spoke Yiddish.
Exactly. So, I said, I have to erase that. He's not a funny man. And the second line of the refrain says, words upon words, he drew out of his feverish mind. So again, feverish mind, it's like very active mind is what the author, the poet wrote. But it doesn't say that. Mochar Kodeach means his crazy mind, his feverish mind. And feverish mind is not nice. So I said, I have to go and I have to tell people that he was not a joker and that he didn't have a feverish mind. He had a calculating mind. He had an amazing mind, photographic memory.
And very focused on what he wanted to do. So that's what you're doing here in Israel, is making sure that the song is understood properly.
I also do it abroad because, I work a lot with Christians. I speak to Christians, evangelicals, Catholics, Lutherans, and I say to them, I'm telling you that this is the finger of God. You are the people that believe, that Jesus came to you. Ben-Yehuda came to us. He's not God. We don't think he's a God, But
he was the right man in the right place at the right time.
We have to recognize that he was a man with a mission. He was a man with a mission.
And you, as his grandson, are as well.
Thank you.
Okay. I really want to thank you. This was really an honor to be able to sit with you. And I hope that we meet again and we'll go visit the house. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Eliezer, ben-Yehuda, Eve Harow on Rejuvenation. Thanks to Tabitha and Ben and to all of you. And I hope you learned a lot in the last 2 hours.